Welcome to With All Due Respect, where we talk the big issues with respect, grace, and sometimes with a sense of moral urgency.
Sometimes.
Not panic, urgency. I'm Michael Jensen.
And I'm Megan Powder-Twine.
And talking about moral urgency, this often lies behind protest. When Megan and I were growing up as Gen Xers, protests and marches were something people were almost nostalgic about. They were associated with the social and political movements of the baby boomers' youth in the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement, Woodstock, Vietnam era protests, etc. They never went away, of course, but protests have become an increasingly common sight on Australian streets again in the last few years. They're part of the public response to COVID restrictions from 2020 onwards. I mean, before that, we had sort of refugee protests around refugees.
There were some,
And in recent years, we've seen an upsurge in protests across the political spectrum, and in particular, protests about immigration or against anti-immigration, against anti-Semitism, and also about the conflict in Gaza. So what are we to make of this? Megan and I are going to talk about how we might engage with protest as Christians. I've seen Christians at all these protests, by the way. We then interview a legal expert on protest to help us think about protest and human rights before we watch the historical film Selma about a very famous protest.
For argument's sake, where we take a debate, cut out the party politics and try to talk it out. Protests are something the Christian church is both engaged in and derided in equal measure. And different parts of the church, as you already said, Michael, think different issues are worth protesting. And I think a really interesting thing is clergy in particular seem to make good figureheads for protest,
Especially
right?
if you can wear a clerical collar so you're visible.
Well, yeah, you're visible. Preaching is great practice for making speeches. And I think also clergy give a stamp of moral authority to a protest, right? They sort of elevate it above mere complaint. It becomes a matter of serious justice when you get a clergy member there. So if you think of the US civil rights movement, many like Dr. Martin Luther King were actually ministers. And even in Australia, a more secular nation, if you look at all the protests that have been happening, clergy are visible presences, aren't they?
Yeah, they're there.
In the various
Absolutely.
protests. So can protests be part of our mission as Christ's people, or is it a distraction from the work of the gospel? And we're told to honour those in authority, but does that mean we can't engage in protest? So, Michael, have you ever been to like a rally or a march?
Yes, several. I went to a rally about Tiananmen Square back in 1989, but partly I was interested in a girl. So, you know, there was two motives. But I remember that. That was more a kind of in solidarity. I mean, we had no influence over the Chinese communist government.
Almost a little like a vigil, I suppose.
But it was a bit of a vigil, yeah. It was very moving, actually. I've been on marches for reconciliation. There was one massive one a few years ago going across the bridge. And I've been at demonstrations about children in refugees, children in detention, refugee children or asylum seekers in detention. So a few. I guess it's not my preferred mode. I'm just highly conscious that when you make a public demonstration like that, you have to be really careful that you're not grandstanding. I'm careful. I guess I'm careful of that. I have been to an anti-Semitism rally as well, and I prayed at that. But I'm cautious that that's not used for other purposes because that's where things get out of control, or it's not the agenda gets because of the modern media landscape, the social media landscape. Things quickly become about something else, and also because you can't always control who's there, and so there are perfectly reasonable issues to protest about, which then they're then adopted by completely unreasonable people or people with agendas that I'm cautious about being associated with publicly. So that's sort of where I'm at with protesting.
You might have even done more than me. I feel like people would think that we
well-known rebel
that I'm more likely to do that than you, but I'm actually very introverted and hate crowds. Like the Easter show is my idea of hell. So I begrudgingly took my kids, but yeah, I find crowds really difficult. So I haven't done it that much as people might think. But yes, I have. Climate change, refugee children in detention. I was also there. Now I'm wondering if we're at the same one. I think I've done something which is more a sort of a pray-in at with Love Makes a Way, if you remember that movement. I've done some things. And you always kind of go, is this the right way to respond to this or not? Is this going to be useful?
So is that on the basis of whether it'll work or whether it will send the wrong message, or what? You're just trying to consider it as a communicative act, because protest is a kind of act of communication, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's like, is this the right moment? Is this the right communication? I think it's potentially a really powerful communicative act. Like, I think it definitely has a place.
And the prophets do great acts of protest, like lying on their sides for 3.5 years and
was
eating
also thinking of
meals cooked on
Ezekiel.
poo.
Yeah, Ezekiel is like the classic. I was actually thinking about Ezekiel, particularly when some people responding to
Isaiah ran nude through the town as well. Yeah.
When people were talking about, so for instance, just to name it, some people were describing the Muslim men who were praying at a recent protest as performative. And I thought to myself, yeah, protest is performative. And we see such performative protest in the Bible. I was thinking of Ezekiel. I mean, yeah, cooking over your own dung is about one of the most performative things you could ever do, right?
Sure, and God designed it that way. It's a communicative act.
And I was thinking about Jesus turning over the tables in the temple. That was an act of protest, and a very performative one. Now, what do people mean by performative? I think what they're potentially saying is we don't think it's sincere.
Yeah, there's an inauthenticity, or something is being used. So I think perhaps, public prayer, they're just using it to kind of make a point rather than actually genuinely praying.
If you're a devout Muslim, you have to pray a certain amount of times a day, right? That's a non-negotiable. But there's a difference between something being performative and something being insincere. And you could be performing something aware of how it's going to come across as a communicative act, but still be sincere about it. And I guess I really think of that because I'm a preacher. And actually, if you want to connect it, there's a podcast that I speak on about preaching and the arts, and I address this. So you can look up that episode. I can't remember what the podcast is called, but if you look for me, podcast Preaching in the Arts, you'll come across it. And I'm basically saying, actually, preaching is a performance, right? And we struggle with that word, but indeed it is. It doesn't mean that you're insincere. It doesn't mean that what you're saying isn't good.
No, I think the issue is grandstanding, not performance.
Yes.
So there is. So, you go into a pulpit, the old pulpits used to have, sir, we would see Jesus. Right?
Yeah.
And sir or ma'am, today in today's language, so yes, there's a performance, but the danger of grandstanding is always going to be there, and in the pulpit and elsewhere. And I suppose that's the accusation against an overly concocted sense of public protest. Is this really about everybody thinking you're a good person? Is this really about you? Or is it about, are you really pointing to the cause?
I mean, it's probably one of the difficulties of doing good in anything. And certainly Jesus addresses that in several ways in Scripture. I mean, the Pharisees being a particular example of people who...
I think it's a salutary warning, but it's not a ban on the actual... I mean, you can't ban performative acts, but it's a warning of the spiritual danger of this public performance of protest. Are there any other limits that you put? I mean, we live in a country in which, in democracy, protest is part of what we do. It's it's engagement in civic life. It's to be encouraged, not dissuade. We're not to dissuade that sort of thing. But in Iran, there are protests going on where people, are clearly being met with a hail of bullets.
I think the reason why it should be legal is because it is a way, when other restrictions are being put on your freedoms, it is something that you can do that, maybe you're being silenced, maybe you're not getting access to something. But unless they've got everyone locked up in their houses, which I guess can happen when you get into a very extreme type of authoritarianism,
Or if you've got COVID going on.
Well, there's a whole other issue about wisdom, right, which we can talk about in a moment. But going out in protest is an act that you can do even when things are against you. And we'll talk about it a bit later, but when I was watching Selma and you're thinking about the civil rights movement, some of that was that problems where Black people in America didn't have the ability to access their vote. Well, if you can't use your vote, what can you do? What can you do? So protest... the embodied nature of protest, I think, is something that has a universal
It's a moment
right?
of voice for the voiceless. I think that's we're wonderfully blessed by that. I think people should be obedient to, law abiding as they protest in our society. So I think it's important that people follow the directives of the authorities for the sake of safety, because the point of our peaceful protest is not to cause unrest or destruction. And that's always a danger when a large crowd of people gather.
I think that's wisdom comes into it about when is something going to be unnecessarily dangerous or when is something going to be counterproductive, like you just annoy so many people. It will be, you've got to think about that. If it's a communicative act, if it's not being persuasive, then why have you bothered?
I find it interesting that 1968, the year of protest across America, Nixon got elected.
Right.
because partly the reaction to protest was conservative. It was like, we don't like this. This is unrest, and this is causing division. And disruption.
I mean,
it's not peaceful protest at all.
That thing is that there's a moment in which things become upheaval, and you get something happens out of that when something desperately needs to happen. So backlash doesn't necessarily mean you were wrong to do the thing in the first place. I think, to be very clear. But I think
that's a matter of tactics.
Yeah, it's tactics.
Does it work? Well,
that's
sometimes
right.
it's backlash because
it's actually working.
Well, maybe working, maybe it's causing you're actually not winning your point.
Yeah. So there's all sort of tactical kind of things you need to think about. I think, you should be. So coming into it, Christians are told, I think, to obey the law as much as we can because God has given an ordered society rather than a chaotic, anarchic one.
Yes.
As a good thing in the world. However, I think that within that, of course, there are going to be some laws which we don't obey, and we see that with the apostles, right? Obviously, they didn't obey laws God about not
rather than
telling people the gospel,
Acts
right?
chapter 5, yeah.
But I think you need to have a good justification for not obeying the law, and I think often the justification is not I feel something strongly.
No. So I was invited to a protest about refugees, about children in detention, which I think was a terrible. They were voiceless. I think it was a blot on our nation's soul.
I agree. Yeah.
But I wasn't comfortable that. Well, first of all, I actually in my dealings with politicians, there had been response back and forth. Like it wasn't like they were deaf. But also, I was invited to break the law in doing it, and I didn't feel that this was a moment. Others disagreed, but I felt that I couldn't break the law in protesting at this because I had channels for advocacy in a different way. So I didn't think there was justification sufficient to break the law at that moment.
Yeah, and that came into like some of the COVID protests, and I think that people should retain rights to protest. But in that case, I thought in this particular case, actually people are being asked not to gather for really good reason, So wisdom suggests, therefore, if it went on and on and on for no good reason, then I think maybe you start to you go, well, actually, this is when a physical protest is valid. But obviously people thought differently. They thought really strongly about that.
Yeah, that's right. Do you have any principles before we finish? Like what principles would you say if you're a Christian considering going to a protest?
I think, as we've already talked about, there are some dangers inherent in a crowd, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And I think also, so you can and we saw that in recent protests in Australia where I feel like and that's being looked into, I think the police overstepped what they should have done. And I think certainly the government and the police force need to look at that. But also, if you're organising a protest, you need to have proper care and consideration for the people going. So you need to take that into account. So I do think you do need to think through, how urgent is this issue? What are we trying to say? How can we do it safely as much as possible? All of those things have to be there. I think, so for instance, at the moment, would I go out? I was thinking about the US. Would I go out and march against ICE? I think I would, because I think there's something sufficiently serious going on, and it's something in which the human rights are being eroded. And I think when human rights are being eroded in a serious way and democracy is being eroded in a serious way, that is when we need to take an extra step, which could be dangerous for us. But the alternative is much more dangerous.
Yeah. So I would that they're really great principles. And I think you can see that Christians might validly differ
Yeah.
On it, and there's a need for discernment, and I think therefore a need for grace, I should say, not gratitude, grace to one another in making those decisions. I would say truth is really important, and so that's where there are lots of issues where I go, I just don't know enough about this. I can see there's an injustice, but I need to know more before I do it. I think peacefulness is quite key. I think we're not about destructive or violent protest. I do think you might say the police probably overstepped, but I think the crowd also overstepped on that day that we're talking about a few weeks ago. I think also there is a willingness, if the cause is sufficiently great, there should be a willingness to suffer rather than to be the one who is violent. This was true in the civil rights protests.
And you sort of think of Gandhi and so on. I think that's the thing. There are going to be some consequences that you might need to accept. And how do you do that in a non-violent way? And I hope that you would be, when you're doing that, say, for instance, if you're interacting with the law forces, understanding, for instance, that they're not your ultimate enemy. they're being given instructions by someone else and so on. So you would still want to show God's love even in those moments.
Yes, and then I would say just beware of being co-opted because that's so common and prevalent. And so I feel like some of the immigration marches, but I personally also feel some of the peace in the Middle East marches have elements in them that I'm uncomfortable with because I feel like there's people that we wouldn't want to associate with there, or we wouldn't want to be heard saying those slogans. We might disagree on what those are, but I feel like that's something we should be very aware of.
I think, and you need to put some discernment in there. For instance, for me, it'd be more important to think about who's organising it, because you always get a mass of people that you can't control all of the people in it. And again, you would want to think about what's the seriousness of this and the potential win that would be got from this that'll be worth the danger of the fact that there will be elements there that aren't great. But who is doing it? Who is organising it?
That's key. Crucial. Yeah, absolutely.
That's key.
Absolutely. Still to come. What exactly are the laws around protest in Australia, and how do they relate to human rights? It'd be great to know, wouldn't it? We talk to a law professor who's researching the right to protest, and then we follow up with a film about a famous civil rights era protest. Be our guest, opening up the conversation to others. Professor Maria O'Sullivan is an associate professor at Deakin Law School. She's the author of a number of international and national publications on the subjects of public law, human rights and refugee law, and her research has been cited in a judgment in the High Court of Australia by the Advocate General of the Court of Justice of the European Union. And that's a big deal.
That's a big deal
in the law world, and in reports of parliamentary inquiries and law reform commissions in Australia. And very importantly for our topic today, she's currently conducting research on the law of protest. Professor Maria O'Sullivan, thanks so much for joining us on With All Due Respect.
You're welcome, Michael and Megan. Lovely to be here.
Well, now, Maria, I wanted to start with something personal and ask you, how did you first become interested in protest law and human rights? Why are you passionate about this particular subject?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I have Irish background, so I think my family were quite interested, obviously, in Northern Ireland. And then I lived near Moree. So my father was born in Moree, for those who are not aware, particularly in other jurisdictions in Australia. That's in New South Wales, and it traditionally has a high Indigenous population. And so obviously in the 60s, you had the freedom rides. So I was born in Narrabri, which is quite close to Moree. And so those social justice issues were always talked about. And then I guess at university, I really excelled in human rights, and I wanted to contribute to society as well as being a legal scholar. So it's sort of my value system.
And so in Australia, when people say, I've got a right to protest, what does that actually mean constitutionally and legally?
Yeah, legally we have a right to peaceful assembly under international human rights law. So, of course, Australia is a party to a treaty called the International Covenant on Civil Rights. And to put it very succinctly, that means that under international law, Australians have a right to peaceful assembly. And we can talk about later, if you like, what peaceful means. But in Australia, you're right, in certain states, we have the right to protest. Again, that's defined as the right to peaceful assembly, and that's in the ACT, Victoria and Queensland, where there's a human rights charter. That makes quite a bit of difference when courts are looking at the issue and police are enacting that or implementing that in practice. Now, in the other jurisdictions in Australia, in the states and territories like New South Wales, we still have the right to protest, but it's under judge-made law, common law. And in terms of the practicalities of that, it means that when we have all these debates about whether something's authorised or not, and this is the big issue in New South Wales, it doesn't mean when you protest without authorisation you're doing something illegal. It just means you don't have authority to do that from the police.
So it's interesting. You're talking about how some jurisdictions, states within Australia have legislated some human rights, but there's no Bill of Rights, of course, in Australia. What difference does that make to protest and protest law in Australia?
Well, speaking for Victoria, I think there's two things. When legislation is enacted or sort of amended, there has to be consideration of the human rights that are set out in the Charter, and that does include peaceful assembly. So there has to be what's called a statement of compatibility, and when a bill is introduced, there has to be that statement. Now, other jurisdictions like New South Wales and South Australia and Western Australia who don't have a charter may do that sort of thing as part of parliamentary debates, but it's absolutely essential in a jurisdiction like Victoria. So that's the parliamentary consideration of human rights, which is quite formal. And then secondly, I think speaking in Victoria, I think it affects the police culture. Now, obviously, there's a whole debate about law enforcement, and I'm not saying that Victoria is perfect, but I think legally speaking, at least, the police in Victoria have to consider the Charter, which means they have to consider peaceful assembly.
I do find it fascinating, the differences between the states, and the difference that Victoria, it seems to me, seems more, more like Canada or France, and whereas New South Wales kind of has a more British tradition. I mean, is that a fair analysis of the comparison between the two?
Yeah, it's fair in terms of the common law. So we talk about common law meaning judge-made law. So there's a big debate, obviously, in society about where we get the power of law from. Does it come from Parliament, which is representative, or should it be developed by courts? And then you get the whole debate about activist courts, which I don't really buy into. But say we want Parliament to have most of the power, we should probably then have a charter where it's enhanced or, reflected in statute. So I would say in New South Wales, there's more, implementation of court-made principles. And we can see that also in that litigation that's been happening. For those who are not aware, one of the problems in New South Wales is that they have this permit system where people, if they want to protest, have to get a permit from the police. And then if that's rejected, or if the police want to appeal also, they have to go to court. And so you get these last-minute court challenges because, firstly, they have an authorisation or permit system. And secondly, possibly one of the contributors is the lack of a human rights charter there.
So you said it's a problem. Why is it a problem? Is it you expressing a preference for the Victorian system?
Yeah, so Victoria, for those who are not aware, don't have the permit system. And our Premier has expressed a reluctance not to go down the permit route. So what happens in New South Wales is that you need to notify the police that you're doing the protest within 7 days, and you have to have a plan. And there have been a couple of times where literally an hour before the protest is scheduled to occur, there's a court decision saying whether it should go ahead, and all these last-minute hearings on a Sunday. And it's just not a great way to conduct protest negotiations and have protest authorised, I think, just because of the last-minute nature of the litigation. And of course, there's a big access to justice issue. If one believes in equality of arms, so the equality of people to access protest, it's problematic because those protesters have to find pro bono, for those who don't know, that's sort of like free legal advice to get those challenges up in court.
If they don't get permission, what's the impact of that upon their right to protest and upon what happens at the protest?
Yeah, because the authorisation in New South Wales means that protesters, if they abide by the planned route, and that is a condition. So if they go from Town Hall to Parliament House in New South Wales and they do as instructed under the authorisation, they can't get charged with public order offences such as obstruction of traffic and a couple of other things. So that means, a lot of people, for example, may not want to protest if they're going to be charged with something. So school teachers, everyone, but particularly those that don't want charges against them for their work. And there's a lot of people who can't have a charge against them, even if it's a public order charge, because it affects their right to work. And so the fact that you won't be charged if you abide by the conditions is a huge benefit. The downside is you may get rejected by the police, and it can be quite discretionary.
Yes, and so I wanted to come back to the word you said at the beginning. You said we could talk about this later, and it's the word peaceful, because that's in any law. There's the word which is up for debate, or definition is very important. How long is the piece of string in this case? And I think the word peaceful is obviously the most contested part. What does peaceful look like? How is peaceful defined at practice, and how do you think it should be defined?
Yeah, reasonable minds differ on this approach. I always draw upon international human rights law. I know there's a big debate about the role of international law in Australia, but as you can see in what's happening in the world today, I believe that Australia, if they're signatories to treaties, can't pick and choose which international law instrument they choose to abide by. So if we take that as a given, that we're part of an international order and we're a signatory, so we're a party, we've signed up to this important international human rights treaty, this covenant I mentioned on civil rights, that was drafted back in 1966, by the way, and Australia was also quite heavily involved in some of these treaties. So if we take that as a given, that international law does matter, the UN Human Rights Committee has defined peaceful assembly as one not involving physical damage to property, so serious physical damage to property, and obviously assault of people. So basically, if people have placards and they're walking down a thoroughfare, even if they obstruct traffic, even if they obstruct pedestrians going about their daily life, that will not constitute violence. And then the second thing the UN Human Rights Committee has said is that even if a couple of people in a protest are violent, for example, there's been scenes, in the last few years of some protesters setting fire to bins, and doing some violent acts. Just because a couple of people in the protest do that, or maybe assault police, does not make the whole protest violent. And that's really important in terms of also what we saw in New South Wales a few weeks ago.
Thinking about that, that's sort of one side of the violence is what can come from the people who are protesting. But how would it change, perhaps, you're talking about the police culture in Victoria, how does it change the way that police interact with the protesters if they've got more of a human rights kind of culture in terms of reacting to protest?
Yeah, and I don't want to make too much of that because we have had issues in Victoria too, but I think I do absolutely know that the Victoria Police undertake training in human rights law. Now, this is not to disparage other police forces because I think other jurisdictions hopefully would have that too. But I can speak with some knowledge from the Victorian jurisdiction that because we have the Human Rights Charter and because Victoria Police have to consider human rights issues when they're doing their training, then police are trained in what's required under the Charter, which I think just helps that human rights, what we call a human rights culture.
So perhaps prevent some of the abuses or perceived abuses that happen when police are not sure about how to interact with people in a way that respects human rights.
Yeah, again, we've had some police law enforcement, how would I put it politely? We've had some issues in Victoria.
Yes.
And there was, the use of pepper spray, and there's been litigation about that in Victoria. That was about a protest outside an arms convention in Melbourne. So I would say it's not perfect, but at least it does bring that into their mind, and it comes from the top. So it has to be, if you're being trained as a police officer and you get a day or whatever it is on the Human Rights Charter, at least it's something that perhaps goes into the thinking that a police officer does, ideally.
Obviously. It's always ideal, right?
Yeah.
Now, what about the intersection of hate speech and hate speech legislation and the right to protest? So this is, of course, peaceful, of course, means as you said, not damaging property or persons. That seems the violence interpreted as it should be, as in actually violence. But then, of course, there are violent incitements to violence, you might say. So some would say we can have a right to protest, but you don't have a right to incite violence or hate against or vilify particularly groups. How do those laws intersect, and are they doing so effectively? Or too effectively, you might say.
Yeah. So this international covenant has an exception, like many human rights provisions do, and that's reflected also in any domestic human rights charter in Australia. So it'll say you have the right to peaceful assembly, but there are exceptions. So the state can restrict the right to peaceful assembly for reasons of public safety, public order, national security, public health, which is what happened in COVID when protests were limited, and then the rights and responsibilities of others. So that's where you would get the legitimacy of certain hate speech restrictions or certain hate speech laws, where you would say, okay, to protect the well-being or the privacy rights or whatever rights to be free from racism of other people, we can limit certain slogans, etc., or limit certain acts of protest. So that's the first thing, but that any restriction has to be proportionate. So that means you can't say, okay, well, there's a hate speech problem, we're going to ban protest entirely in Australia. There has to be some proportionality. And then with the issue of whether it's working, I would probably speak to two examples of the hate speech that's been talked about. So that's From the River to the Sea and Globalise the Intifada as examples of contested hate speech, which on one hand are seen as slogans of Palestinian uprising or Palestinian resistance against an illegal occupation, and on the other hand are seen as anti-Semitic by Jewish and Israeli citizens. So we've got a situation where a certain slogan or expression might be interpreted differently. So that's where we get the problem with hate speech. So yes, under international and domestic law, we can restrict peaceful assembly. It has to be proportionate. It can't be out of kilter, can't be disproportionate. But it gets problematic when we're trying to stop certain slogans being said. So that's currently being debated in Queensland.
What about how it intersects? So obviously we're two ministers here and theologians. How does the right to protest intersect with freedom of religion? What are some of the possible concerns there?
Yes, that's a live issue. Now, I'm not a constitutional expert on the religion. So there is a protection from about religion in the Constitution. That's quite a niche area and I'm not an expert on that. But I can say obviously that, again, in the International Covenant on Civil Rights, there's an exception for the rights of others. So to protect people's right to express and enjoy their religion, we can put certain limitations on peaceful assembly. So that's also reflected in any domestic charter here in Australia. So there was a constitutional challenge to that, though, in New South Wales, which was successful. And that's where in New South Wales they tried to stop protests outside any place of worship. But the problem is when you look at the Sydney CBD, for those who may not know, but in Sydney, there's churches everywhere. And so the problem was if you stopped protest out, I think it was something like 500 metres outside a place of worship, it effectively has a ban. And you remember I said that effective bans or explicit bans are very problematic for human rights law. So that was rendered unconstitutional under this implied freedom of political communication in the Constitution in Australia, which is the only real human rights type provision apart from that religion one in the Constitution. So I guess I was schooled as a Catholic, and so I can speak, and I think you might be interested and your listeners might be interested in the issue of protest, which is about religion. Where do you draw the line? So there's it was put to me, I think quite rightly, a couple of months ago when I was speaking to religious people that people affected by abuse within the clergy, and this particularly unfortunately does relate to, and I can say this as someone who was schooled as a Catholic, it applies to the Catholic religion. In regional Victoria, they had protest banners actually on the fence of, I think, either religious institutions or schools. And so that was a campaign from survivors of clergy abuse or, schoolmaster abuse, so basically Catholic abuse. And so that was considered problematic, the fact that, you would have any limitation on that sort of protest. So there are very complex social, religious, and survivor reparation debates about that. So very complex area of law.
Certainly I can say as a clergy person that I would want to protect that right, because I think the church should of all institutions not be, not be immune. It should be ready to be transparent, to be judged, if you like, to have people kind of hold them to account. We should of all people be really open to that. So I think that's a really fair comment from those people who are survivors, absolutely. And also what you're saying about Sydney, I've been in a protest outside the St Andrews, the Anglican Cathedral. I'm a Baptist, so
terrible.
But of course, there were many clergy members there. Like, it's not necessarily like a lot of clergy, or when we look at what's happening in the US, are very interested in protecting these kind of rights. So sometimes it's not as the kind of distinctions that people like to make between sort of the people who protest or the people who want their religious buildings protected are not, it's not that clear-cut a distinction between people.
I guess it was for St Andrews, just knowing people there, wasn't really. They've had protests in Sydney Town Hall Square for years, but it was on Sunday mornings. That's when they're kind of set times of worship. So that was the tension for them, which has been going on in recent years, particularly with the pro-Palestinian protests, I guess. Maria, if you could reform Australian protest law tomorrow, what would you change, or are we doing it okay?
It's a difficult one because all the restrictions sort of started, I think, with the climate protest crackdowns. And if you excuse me for being political, but, we're obviously a mining country. So there was a strong mining lobby interest, I guess, in restricting climate protests. So obviously, and then we've had more recently the pro-Palestinian protests. And I just want to raise that before I go on to the law, because I guess sometimes when I've talked about radio, a lot of people say to me, why are we bringing international conflicts into Australia? And it's a really difficult one because obviously we need to think about social cohesion and the Australian community, and, literally not bringing conflicts into Australia. But I think historically Australia has always had solidarity with certain movements, whether it be South Africa. Obviously, we were involved in Vietnam, so I think there was a definite national interest in people, obviously, people conscripted to Vietnam had a very strong interest in it. But I think it's important for countries like Australia, with our beautiful democracy, to stand up for those, including refugees, people subject to racism, to stand up in solidarity. So I think that's the first thing, perhaps the discourse about protest. And it's a bit problematic because in Victoria we have had weekly protests, and there's been a big debate about the commercial interests of the cafes and so forth. Actually, there's data that they benefit from protests because of people come into the city. So again, that's about social discourse and understanding how important it is to protest, because a lot of people say to me, oh, well, I'm sick of the protests and why do they have to be every week? And my response is there's actually no limit to protests. You can have it every week if that's the case. So that's the first reform, just more education, I guess, about how important it is. And then secondly, I would definitely get rid of the permit system. I don't think that's a great idea, particularly for access to justice and those last-minute court interventions. And then I think probably more of a human rights culture, so whether you put that into Australia with the Commonwealth Charter or more in the states and territories. And there are campaigns in New South Wales, South Australia and Western Australia that I know of to introduce a human rights charter. So that's the main, I guess, reform. And then I guess just thinking about how disproportionate some of the sentences are, particularly for climate protesters. So for those who don't know, the sentences for climate protesters are quite excessive. And we actually get that from some US law that was not exactly copied here, but it was heavily influenced by anti-climate protest laws in the United States.
Can you give us an example of that disproportionality?
Yeah, so if you use a lock-on device, if a climate protester goes to, say, a port in Newcastle, so that's a big issue at the moment with rising tide, or sort of port in Sydney, and you somehow impede traffic or you lock on yourself to something, maybe also in Tasmania in the forestry context, then instead of, say, I think it used to be 6 months, it's now 2 years or 5 years, just depending on the severity. Now, I'd have to double check those exact figures, but there was a steep increase in the sentences that people were given. I can absolutely definitely give you one example. Violet Coco, the quite well-known New South Wales climate protester, was given a 15-month, so 1 year and 3 month sentence for allegedly obstructing an ambulance on Sydney Harbour Bridge. That was found to be an unsustained charge. It was not sustained, and she didn't serve. Well, I don't think she served that time because she appealed it, but that's one example of where she didn't, to my knowledge, cause any damage, but that obstruction charge carried a 15-month, and perhaps other things too, but in total, 15-month sentence. So that's a prison sentence for protesting.
Thanks. That's really helpful to know.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just. So is it because she did it in the cause of a protest? Is that why you say the sentence is too high, or because it seemed to me obstructing an ambulance is, if it was true, would be quite a serious thing.
Oh yes, yes. And now that's the problem. If you protest on a thoroughfare, for example, with the a main road in Melbourne or something, sometimes you will obstruct ambulance, and that's the role of a protest organiser is to inform the authorities, not by way of a permit or authorisation, but it's good practice to always inform the authorities, and that's what happens in Victoria before you protest. So ambulances and those other traffic can be diverted. So that's what we do to prevent it. But yes, you're right. Obstructing an ambulance is a concerning issue and should lead to charges if that's done on purpose. But in this instance, my understanding was that actual factual, we call it the factual substratum. So that was not held to have occurred. And so therefore the charge was not upheld.
Thanks.
If we could finish just maybe with one final question, why is protest essential for a healthy democracy?
Because it gets things aired out in public. So instead of people being on their computers, of course we all use computers, but instead of people being underground and on encrypted message platforms like Telegram and Reddit and whatever, on the dark web, exchanging, maybe things that lead to violent extremism, it's actually better if people have a principle or an idea that they want to air, like climate protests, etc. It should be done in public, and that can be debated then in public. And obviously also, if it's public, it leads to media coverage and hopefully consideration by politicians in an open air dialogue.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Professor Maria Sullivan. You've really helped us clarify what's going on in our country, and I think too, just the right to protest as a not just defensible but indispensable in our democracy for the sake of social cohesion rather than against it. So, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Megan and Michael.
Still to come. It's often easier, as with many things, to evaluate protest movements with hindsight. So next we're going to take a look at an historical film about a very famous protest movement and the famous Christian who headed it up, Martin Luther King Jr. Through the Wardrobe, Finding Truth Through Story. Selma is a 2014 American historical film based on the 1965 Selma to Montgomery voting rights marches, a significant moment in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And it centres on the leadership of Baptist pastor Martin Luther King Jr. The film stars an impressive cast, including David Oyelowo as King.
Well done in saying his name.
I'm not sure I did it right, but anyway. Tom Wilkinson as President Lyndon B. Johnson, others such as Tim Roth, Cuba Gooding Jr. and Oprah Winfrey. It was nominated for several Oscars, including Best Picture, and it won Best Original Song for John Legend's Glory, which uses biblical quotes
Certainly does.
in it. Let's have this clip from a speech with Martin Luther King stating why they needed to protest.
As long as I am unable to exercise my constitutional right to vote, I do not have command of my own life. I cannot determine my own destiny, for it is determined for me by people who would rather see me suffer than succeed. Those that have gone before us say, no more, no more. That means protest, that means march, that means disturb the peace, that means jail, that means risk, and that is hard. We will not wait any longer. Give us the vote. That's right, no more. We're not asking, we're demanding. Give us the vote.
So, Michael, how did you find this movie?
Oh, I really enjoyed. I thought this is very, very well done indeed, and partly it's great acting. Right? It's really good acting. I think also what's really great about it is it didn't just kind of make Martin Luther King a hero, and he's a very human, very flawed individual.
They brought out some of the flaws, not extensively, like they were focusing on the protest movement rather than a biography of
It wasn't a
Martin Luther
biography
King.
of him, okay, no.
But there was a couple of things like his marriage or his own sense of responsibility for some of the violence and death that occurs.
He's a strategist, right? So also he's a kind of he's a pragmatist as well as an idealist at the same time. He's kind of doing what needs to be done, and that's good. I mean, I think sometimes we make it too easy to kind of make saints, the stained glass window saints, out of people. I'm more intrigued by the Martin Luther King story as a fellow Christian because of his flaws, because of the wrestle he had, and he knew he was a sinner. I don't think he denied this in his life. I think he wrestled with his deep flaws, but also, of course, the FBI is kind of trying to discredit him every way, and you had J. Edgar Hoover doing that,
and that was probably very true to life. I have heard some quibbles with the fact that Lyndon B. Johnson isn't presented the most
No, I was about to say Lyndon B. Johnson.
positively.
Oh, really? Because I would have thought Lyndon Baines Johnson I thought it was kind of a bit too kind to Lyndon Baines Johnson is a terrible individual in many ways.
Well, apparently, though, people are saying, was he really that resistant?
To the civil rights marches. Yeah. I mean, he's saying, look, he's got this project for the Great Society, to end poverty. And he did have this project. That was true. And he kept telling King, just wait. And Martin Luther King's going, we can't wait. We can't vote. We can't participate in this
That's
democracy.
Really powerful when he says, here are the outcomes of us not being able to vote, which ends up in deaths, basically.
Well, and the famous bombing of the Baptist church and the four girls died,
goodness.
Which is very well done, very well portrayed.
That's about 5 minutes in, and I just visibly recoiled. That was
the perpetrators basically got away with. They knew who did it. I mean, it's sort of real. I mean, even into the 2020s, there was sort of discussions about the perpetrators. It was done by the Ku Klux Klan. So I liked the complexity. I liked also the kind of the discussion of the practical nature of trying to get something done. And I also thought there's a sort of open-ended question here about a law has been changed, but have hearts been changed? There's still work to be done here. It's not a finished story of glory.
Well, the interesting thing about and it definitely does kind of not suggest now everything's fine. I do think it makes a really good argument for why protests can be very effective.
Yeah.
Because obviously part of why they get the laws around ensuring that African Americans could actually access their voting and be able to register and that so on. So interesting because I happen to know like one of the follow-up stories that doesn't come out in the film. So, right at the end they say, here's what happened with each of these people. And so George Wallace, who's the governor of Alabama and is a villain in this piece, and he was, he was actually making political hay out of the fact that he was anti-desegregation.
Oh, yeah.
And he said that. He kind of didn't start as populist on that. And then I think someone from the Ku Klux Klan beat him and he went, right, well, I'm just going to join in, right? But we know that George Wallace, because what they said in the film was he gets he's paralysed later in life.
He gets shot.
Yeah.
He's an assassination attempt.
But in fact, actually, I think one of the women who's related to someone that he had, caused, a African-American woman comes in and is very gracious to him after he's shot, like another politician.
Mm. And
it's a defining moment for him. So his daughter – so look this up. His daughter has spoken about it and how that completely changed his mind.
Yeah.
And he went – and in fact then he gets back in and he's governor again after that, and that's when he does things like ensures that he's got representation of black people on different committees and councils and so on. So it's interesting. Yes, the protest obviously is part of what it helps change the law. There's another little story that could have been told there that could be told by another thing where you see, in fact, actually it's grace that can change hearts, that kind of thing.
That's less the focus here.
That's less the focus here because this is on why, what happened with these protests.
Yeah, I think also the role of faith is interesting in this. I do wonder whether, because it's African Americans you're talking about, you can speak more openly about faith in a positive way, whereas it wouldn't be if this was on the white side of things. Faith is often eclipsed in stories about that we tell about white culture, whereas here, and so I do wonder if there's sort of an implicit kind of double standard.
I don't know, because there was, really interesting that Martin Luther King, and he did this is historical, put out a plea to clergy, and they come, and a whole lot of white clergy come and be part of the march. And in fact, as they show, one of them dies.
Yeah, and that's his letter from Birmingham jail.
Yes,
he criticises the white clergy for saying, "Go slowly, go slowly. We can't back you if you're going to have these marches."
Yeah.
And I feel very very accused by that because of my own sort of moderation, my own caution. So it's remarkable, but it is, I would say, the theological imagination of the African-American church that drives this, which interestingly…
and is very much brought out in the film.
Yeah, Dietrich Bonhoeffer sees it when he visits America in the 1930s. Sorry to mention Bonhoeffer yet again, but it's interesting that he sort of goes, oh, wow, you can connect a real faith to protest here, to real justice. You don't have to have them. You don't have to be one or tava, there's a real passionate love of Jesus and a real passionate vocation towards justice here going together. And I think you see that here.
And particularly, I think what's so powerful, and again, a flawed person, but Martin Luther King's focus on nonviolence about the way of peace, without being, obviously, his way of peace still involved strong protest, as we see in this film.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was defiant. It was kind of, he was breaking laws. But they were unjust laws. And so he made that call. And of course, by the way, we shouldn't underplay the call of people in the African-American community to engage in terrorism. I mean, Malcolm X is a totally different story, right?
Malcolm X comes into this film, which is just a little intriguing cameo. And that's a whole other interesting story. I mean, one thing, I don't know why, but I didn't actually see this when it came out. And I remember I intended to, so I don't know what happened. So I'm really glad we watched it because it's a really good film. But watching this again when protesters in our street again just reminded me, I think, of the importance of the right to protest and the importance of protecting democracy, because at its heart is love for and dignity of all people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's salutary, particularly in the current time when we're kind of looking at protests we don't necessarily like, but we should remember that, the freedom to protest is my freedom to protest as well as the other person's freedom to protest too. Coming up next episode, thanks for being part of With All Due Respect. No, I need to do that in a different order. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just a title.
Well, thanks for being part of With All Due Respect. Coming up in our next episode, evangelicals, we love that word gospel.
We do.
I mean, evangelical means gospel, but we actually don't agree much about what it means, what it is. I've been in theological college when people on the faculty disagreed about what they meant by gospel.
Did they come to fisticuffs?
well, over cups of tea.
Right.
And even less how we speak and live it in the public square.
And Michael and I have both copped flack on this one. So we've invited biblical
Friendly
scholar
fire.
and author Dr. Nijay Gupta to help us think this one through. With All Due Respect is hosted by me, Megan Powell-Dutois, and Michael Jensen. It's produced by Derek Yeo, editing by Alec Green and Graziella Adafune. With All Due Respect is part of the Hope Media Network, Radio 103.2. So go to hope1032.com.au and click onto our Facebook group to join in the debates with all due respect.